Very big welcome for those of you that don't know me. I'm Chris Robb, the CEO of Mass Participation World. Delighted to be hosting, as every fortnight, a medical perspective to navigating a safe and sensible return to mass participation events. Delighted to be partnering with this and welcome an esteemed panel from the IIRM Institute of International Race Medical. And joining us tonight, and just whilst I'm doing that introduction, I'm going to put a poll in just to understand who's joining us, which I do every week. John Cianca, MD, Board Chair of IIRM, joining us from Houston in Texas. Hello, John.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for being here. Chris Troyanos, Executive Director of IIRM, joining us from Boston, I believe. Chris?
Chris, good to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Matt Sedgley, MD, Medical Director of Baltimore Marathon, joining us from just north of Washington, D.C. Hello, Matt.
Hello, good evening.
Thanks for joining us. May Tan, MD, Medical Director for the Dublin Marathon and Race Series, joining us from Dublin.
Hi, everybody.
Great to see you. And Paolo Emilio Amadi, MD, Medical Manager, World Athletics Health and Science Department. Hello, Paolo. Good to see you again.
Hi. Nice to see you all.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So just pop the results of that poll, and as expected, mostly people from the mass participation industry, a few from other areas, some people from government, and some people from other parts of the sports industry. So there you can see the results of those. And then just while I do leave that up there for a moment, I'm going to pop another poll just to get an understanding of where within the industry you sit. As I go through a little bit of housekeeping, as I mentioned already, you'll be mute all the way through. Put your questions in the chat, please. We've allocated about 75 minutes, but we've got some great content here, and depending on how many questions, we may go on a little bit longer. But if you need to leave, we are live on Facebook, and we are also we are recording this. And it will be put up on the Mass Participation World YouTube channel as well. A couple of quick plugs for a number of other initiatives. It's Strength in Numbers Week next week. So that's Monday afternoon Singapore time, Tuesday morning Singapore time to cover the world, where we just have a chat group, and a number of people on the call will often join us. Mike Nishi's often there, and Phil Purvis, who was here earlier. But it's literally an hour's chat to understand what's happening in your part of the world. The aid station, Stefan Movin is on the call tonight. A wonderful interview I did with him last week. That goes live tomorrow. Some great insights into the Swedish Alliance, the group that's been pulled together there in the industry and sport, and working with government in Sweden in terms of trying to get events back. The next web series in 2 weeks' time, disaster strikes, case studies from short lead time event cancellations. We've got one case study there where the event was cancelled 15 minutes before they started their road closures. So give a sense of what they were dealing with there. Here to help at any stage, connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Mass Participation World, or email me directly, chris@chrisrob.asia. And look out if you're not with us already on our Road Ahead newsletter, which goes out every Friday with a bunch of different initiatives in it. So we're going to get, I'll just end that poll and put the results. And as expected, we're mostly event organizers here, see the results of those. But we're going to get underway with the presentation shortly with John, who's going to give an overview of the current situation. John will then be followed by Chris, who will give a presentation on challenges to staging events at the moment, some case studies and some rationale around what you should be doing there. We then head on to Matt, who will give a case study, proof of concept of a race with 1,000 runners, and particularly focusing on surveying those runners and what they did in terms of understanding testing and so on before people were able to participate. We'll then go to May, who will talk about volunteers and volunteer safety. And then we'll come back to wrap it up with Paolo, who's going to give some experience in terms of world athletics, defining protocols, some of the things that they did in the World Half Marathon in Gdynia in Poland, and how those have been adapted for the World Relays coming up next week, and the involvement with the Medical Task Force globally. So lots to get through, and let's get underway. You have sharing rights there, John, and I'll pass over to you, and I'll sit in the background. Reminder again, please, if you've got any questions, pop them in at any time. I'll try and moderate those, and hand it over to you, John, please.
Thank you, Chris. Just give me a minute to get, where'd my share screen go? All right, good morning from Houston. I know it's it's the future out there for me, and I welcome you all to your past. It's at 7 o'clock in the morning here. I am going to introduce our presentation for the day. This is a medical perspective on navigating a safe and sensible return to mass participation events. Our objectives are pretty much a restatement of what our individual presentations will be. I'm going to provide an overview, and Mr. Troyanos is going to provide some discussion about how to stage events. Dr. Sedgley will be talking about safety and testing and how that's played out thus far in his events. May will be talking about volunteers and the implications for volunteers, and Paulo will follow with some of his experience at the worldwide level with the events that they have staged and the protocols they've used. So to introduce my topic, are we there yet? Can we get back to mass participation events as we've known them in the past? Here is my background. I am currently the executive board chair for the International Institute for Race Medicine. I am a founding member of the American Road Race Medical Society, which is now IIRM. I'm the former medical director of the Houston Marathon. I do not have any relevant disclosures for today's presentation. So mass participation events, as we've known them in the past, obviously things have changed. I'm going to provide you with a high-level view, considering public health as the first and foremost consideration for us, particularly for those in the medical field. We view the common good as being more important than individual needs at this time. We are in a pandemic. It continues. And the reason it continues is because we continue to sabotage our progress with ill-advised behaviors and attitudes. So the idea being that if we all got together and did the right thing, we could get out of this sooner. And the other unfortunate aspect of this is that the distribution of healthcare and the resources that are necessary for healthcare are not equitably distributed throughout the world. So that impedes our progress as well. So at present, these are our current conditions. This is a map of the deaths per million recently from COVID-19. You can see some of the areas that are hardest hit are in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States and South America. Less so where many of you are in Asia. And so we are in a global pandemic still. There's no question about it. We're not sure when it will end. There has certainly been progress, and it looks better than it did 6 months ago and certainly a year ago. But it's likely that we'll remain in a pandemic through this year. And to some extent, we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 for a long time. So the numbers, which I'm not going to go into to a great extent because they're pretty much known to people and are also a little bit depressing. So millions have been afflicted worldwide. We know that. There have been many deaths. Many of those were preventable if we had done proper measures earlier. And the other side of this, which is yet to really emerge, is the residual effects of COVID-19. My particular specialty, physical medicine and rehabilitation, is very much concerned with how people are going to move forward after they've been infected. What are the signs and symptoms that they still have, and what systems does it affect? And how will that impact their performances? So, to restate the obvious, COVID-19 is preventable with simple measures. But we all have to do them, and we have to do them regularly and diligently. And as I just mentioned, we're not sure how COVID-19 is going to impact people after they've been infected. Some people may not have any residual at all, and others may be significantly affected. So relative to mass participation events, we have to ask several questions in order for us to move forward. The first is, what is the right thing to do when you're considering to stage your event or not? Can we stage the event safely at this time, in the time that would be for your event? So in other words, okay, we've decided to go ahead with our event. Now, how are we going to do it, and how can we do it safely? So as you see here in this cartoon down below, social distancing is quite easy when everyone's static. But what do you do when you have a situation such as this going over the Cooper River, where you've got a throng of people that's incredibly densely packed and not really able to be controlled? So, you know, one would argue that this is not a safe situation in our current pandemic. All right, so what is the right thing to do? Certainly vaccines are presenting us with an opportunity to move forward. However, widespread access is still an issue, and the infrastructure to administer the vaccines can be an issue. Now, since we have an adult in the White House here now in the United States, we've done much better, and our vaccine distribution is going well. We're at about a quarter of the United States has been vaccinated at least once. Actually, no, that's half of the United States has been vaccinated at least once, and up to a quarter has been completely vaccinated. But there are certainly confounders to this progress. There's a lot of misinformation. I'm not sure of the status of it around the world, but certainly in the United States, there's a contingent of people that feels that this is not safe, that it's a conspiracy, that it's all kinds of things that it's not. And there's people that choose not to get vaccinated for one reason or another. Both of these are slowing our emergence from the pandemic. There is no question about it. So we have to remain vigilant. We have to use the simple measures that we know work. Distancing, using a mask, hand washing. It's that simple. We just got to be disciplined enough to do it. So is it reasonable to even stage a mass participation event at this time? And that question is best answered by looking at your community, your host community. What is the situation there? Are you in a position to consider reinstituting your event? Certainly, public agencies have to be more involved than they've ever been in the past. You know, since unfortunate incidents in the last decade, public agencies have been more and more involved in our planning. I can't see how they are going to be less involved going forward. This is, as I said, a public health situation where we have to consider before, during, and after events with regard to the implications that it will have on the host community. So you should expect more stringent oversight and scrutiny of your policies and procedures. And on your part, it really is important to assess your readiness for an event. And I would refer you to this publication that colleagues of mine and I have put out this past summer, published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, on how to assess your readiness as an event. This is widely available to anyone who wants to download it. It's fairly easy to navigate and administer. So I would encourage you, if you have not used this or have not seen it, to take a look at it and ideally implement it, because it will help you understand what you are ready for, what you need to do differently, and how that might play out with regard to your own event. So several factors are going to have to be considered when we look at staging our events, particularly large events. What is the community support and attitude for having an event at any particular time? What's the community infrastructure to support you in staging that event? Now, obviously, many large events have already considered that to some extent, but we have a different set of parameters now that we have to think about. We frankly never really thought about them in the past. So it's somewhat of a reimagination of how we put on races. Race size will be a large factor in determining whether an event can be staged safely. And the budget that goes with a given event will also be impacted because of the additional measures that will have to be taken. And then lastly, and perhaps just as significantly, is what is the volunteer availability and their willingness to participate, given that many people, certainly on the medical side, have been very much involved in administering to the pandemic, and the level of burnout and the safety factors that might go with doing yet another high-risk event will play into whether volunteers are willing to step up like they have in the past. So how are we going to do all this? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to think about public safety. We have to coordinate with public safety agencies in given communities. Events are likely to be mandated even to work with community agencies if they're even allowed to allowed to go forward. So I can imagine that everyone will have to get permission from their local governments or local communities to move ahead. And in doing so, they're going to have to deal with the community agencies that can help as well as oversee what they're doing. This is going to have a large logistical impact, even with basic measures, let alone more complicated schemes that might have to be employed. And PPE requirements, personal protective equipment, is certainly going to be a factor in that. Masks are undoubtedly going to be used broadly, gloves most likely, and in some areas more comprehensive PPE will be needed. So getting that and supplying enough for everyone is going to be first on the logistical scale. As I mentioned, race size is a factor. It is not likely that you're going to be able to see a field like this anytime soon. It's very difficult to really stage an event with any kind of distancing or safety measures in place when you have this many people. It would probably be wiser and easier, certainly, to decrease fields, maybe localize them, and be able to test things out first, see how you can administer to our current situation and move forward safely. Should vaccines be required? Well, Dr. Sedgley is going to tackle this to some extent, but at present, we know that they're very helpful, but they're really not the only thing we have to do. The people that are vaccinated are at greatly reduced risk of becoming significantly ill or dying, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility that they could still have a low-level disease or an asymptomatic form that is still transmissible. And then, of course, there are ethical concerns with mandating vaccines. Some of us would quite readily say, yes, it's the right thing to do. Others won't. And then, should testing be done pre-event? Testing measures are useful, but depending on which test you're using, you're going to get varied results. They really only measure infectivity at that moment. Tomorrow may present with a different situation. And reliability of the test is different. The PCR is very accurate, but it's expensive. And the implications of administering that to 30,000 people is daunting. Rapid antigen testing is cheap, but it's not altogether that sensitive or accurate. And then, of course, in consideration of how we do it, we have to think about costs. Testing costs are going to be significant, if not prohibitive. PPE is costly as well, particularly the more you have to purchase. And then, are the resources even available? PPE is still somewhat difficult to get, and certainly in large quantities. We have to protect everyone involved. That includes volunteers and participants. And the levels of protection that you have in one area may be different. Certainly in medical, it's going to be more significant than it would be perhaps out on the course, but everybody will need some type of protection. And then again, volunteer availability. Is it there for us? So with regard to medical and how we will function, we're going to continue to see the same things we've always seen: heat, hydration problems, fatigue, cardiac situations. Those aren't going to go away. However, COVID-19 may impact how they present. And then, of course, we have to consider what COVID does to participants or people that have had COVID. How will it affect their participation and their performance? We don't know that yet. Certainly, with some of the residual that we're seeing in people, lung function is going to be affected, and endurance undoubtedly would be affected. So it remains to be seen how COVID-19 post incidence will present itself in performance. And then, of course, we still have to prevent the spread of COVID. So, you know, in medical, that means protecting yourself and protecting everybody else around you. You know, certainly spacing is going to be different than it used to be. And so these are all logistical concerns that are important to consider ahead of your event. So some suggestions as you think about moving ahead, or maybe perhaps you've already moved ahead, these suggestions might resonate with you. Stay with the basics. Distancing, masking, washing hands will still work, and they're still vital. You know, interestingly, despite the risk that medical settings, medical professionals are in, there hasn't been outbreaks in medical facilities. That's because PPE is available and it's properly used, and it's a very stringent statement about how well it works. Smaller fields are what I would advise moving ahead with. And the other side of this is, can you feasibly maintain your viability with a smaller event? I know that that's a very difficult question for a lot of race directors. Yes, we can, you know, consider having a smaller field, but what's that going to do to our bottom line? Will we survive with a smaller field? But I really don't see how large fields, 20, 30, 40,000 runners, can be safely staged at this time. Then engage the resources from your community. You're going to need help with this, and you're going to need the blessing of your community as well. And then ultimately, are you ready to stage your event? You have to do some assessment before you even think about moving forward. So where are we now? I think large events are still not feasible, probably not easily made safe, and therefore I don't recommend them for the immediate future. Now, where that ends, I don't know, but I can imagine certainly through much of 2021. Smaller races are probably the best way for us to move forward. Cooperation with local agencies is a necessity. No one with symptoms should participate in this type of event. And others that are at high risk or have symptoms or are unwilling to wear a mask should not participate as well. Those are pretty strong statements, but I think they're all reasonable at this stage. So some final thoughts. We have to consider that we're still in a pandemic. The risk of spread is there. Vaccines, when they're widely used and administered, will be very, very helpful to us, and herd immunity might be able to be achieved. But if we don't have everyone participating and pulling in the same direction, it's going to be hard to achieve. We can't let mass participation events become super spreader events. That's just not acceptable. And large fields are probably an entree into that kind of environment. So I would advise against them at this point. And when you consider staging an event, can you make it smaller? Can you afford and implement the measures you need to make it safe? And that is largely going to be dependent on your own assessments and your own interactions with your host communities. Ultimately, is it in the best interest of all those involved? So with that, I'll say thank you. And Chris Troyanos will go next, and his discussion of some of the things that he's considered in staging the events that he's been involved with. Thank you.
John, welcome up Chris next, if you'd like to get your slides up. Thank you. Just to draw the attention while Chris is getting his slides, we had a request from Gabrielle Solomon for the tool, which has been posted. Thank you, Matt Sedgley, for posting that. That's in the Q&A if anyone wants to pick that one up. And then we'll just keep, if you've got some questions, I see there's a question already in the chat from Tom Carey, and maybe it's relevant to John. We just put it out there now and we pick it up later. Surely it's the space available for an event, not the numbers of people that enter, that's a limiting factor. John, which maybe we come back to you later on to pick that one up, but just to put it out there now, whilst Chris goes ahead. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for John's presentation, and thank you all for joining this morning's and evening's presentation. Again, my name is Chris Troyanos. I am what they call a certified athletic trainer. So in a lot of your countries, that would be considered a physio. My job basically as medical coordinator is to work under and with my medical directors. So again, I am not a medical director at all of these different events that you see listed. So basically my company called Sports Medicine Consultants is a contracted group that helps these events manage and implement all of the medical plans that we put into place. So, as you can see, the largest one that I manage is the Boston Marathon, which we are still working on, which I'll get into some of the things that we're considering. All of these events vary in sizes. I think my smallest event is the Beach to Beacon Road Race at 7,000 people. So anything that we're dealing with is what I consider a large mass participatory event. And all of them obviously were impacted last year, and most of them being impacted this year. I think with the exception of two, all of them are either going to be canceled, postponed, or go virtual. So, much like many of the race directors on this call, my business has been impacted severely. So we're trying to pivot and understand how this is going to work. You're going to find that my presentation is a little bit similar to John's, but I'm going to get into it maybe a little deeper in some areas and maybe just skip over some others, because I know that Dr. Tan and Dr. Sedgel are going to talk about vaccines and testing. But, the one obvious thing is that I, and probably I can say all the people on this panel and on this call, are not experts in the pandemic. This is our first go around with this thing, and we are learning. We're trying to figure out exactly how this is going to play out. So with that, let me just get this off. There we go. With that, we're just trying to understand, what are the right means to come back? How's that going to play out? And as John indicated, it's going to take some time. So just for disclosures again, as I'm going through this, these are my opinions. These are not necessarily the opinions of the events that I help manage. But again, working with so many medical experts, I feel that the directions that we're looking at and my suggestions and what we're going to talk about are things that I'd like you to consider. They're not absolutes, and we know that they're going to change from week to week and month to month. So as we're working on all of these events, obviously, as Dr. Sianka mentioned, we're looking at 2021, but realistically, we also have to start to project out into 2022 and what things need to change then as they are now for this year. We're constantly looking at changes in direction. For us, CDC, World Health Organization, they keep coming out with directives, but unfortunately, those directives keep changing. And a lot of the times I keep telling my clients, and I'm sure you're doing the same, is that you need to follow the science. There are scientific approaches and there are perceptual approaches that our events are looking at to try to make this thing safe. So when the CDC particularly are making changes all the time, it's hard to gain trust in those scientific changes and what they're suggesting. We all need to deal with governmental and with us state approvals. I mean, obviously, any one of the events that I'm managing cannot happen without the government saying yes. But even when the government says yes, and I'll be honest with you, we're getting word that for the state of Massachusetts, that may be somewhere in the middle of May. But as that approval comes through, that is not a blanket approval. So with that, we have to still develop and submit plans that they will sign off on before it happens. Dr. Sianka talked about current infection rates, and there are a lot of numbers. Obviously, there's infection rates, there's fatality rates, but for me, what I'm looking at is what are the hospitalizations? And as I looked at today's numbers in our Commonwealth and our state, right now we have an ICU bed capacity of maybe about 1,400 beds. 75% of those are now currently being used, but only 174 of those are COVID related. That number, I think, is important for us to watch as we move forward. The hospitalization rates are really the key for me, even more so than fatalities and then the amount of viruses that are being put forth every day. You know, we're obviously concerned about the variants and how that's going to play out. So again, something we watch, but we don't know, you know, how that's going to go. We need to make sure that these mitigation strategies are sustainable. You know, as Dr. Sienka said, you've got small versus large events. I'm not convinced right now that you have to do all the things that, say, someone like a Boston or a Falmouth road race with 10,000 people or more need to do in the way of mitigation strategies for events, say, smaller than 2,000 people. I've always felt that, you know, if you have enough space and time to socially distance people, then some of the mitigation strategies we're talking about, that they don't need to be implemented. But again, it's got to be signed off by the government, whether it be the Department of Public Health or your health officer, all need to understand what's going on there. The testing and the vaccine implications, again, continue to change. I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but I'll let Dr. Sedgley talk about that. Volunteer requirements, I know Dr. Tan's going to talk about this, but you know, the anxieties and the concerns that your volunteers, not just medical, but all volunteers, you know, you have to address those, and how you address those are important. And that's going to be ultimately your responsibility. And we all know that you cannot run your event with the amount of volunteers that we need. So how do we work on that to make it happen? Give you an example of some of the things we faced last year, probably in February in 2020, before we canceled the Boston Marathon. You know, I had received a call from a couple of our participating hospitals, and they basically said, Chris, with what we're seeing and how this is going to play out, two things are going to happen. One, the hospital itself cannot support the event. That was one. And two, we cannot let any of our employees volunteer for your event. So that was a major blow to my medical program and our planning. And obviously one of the many reasons why we canceled last year's race. So, you know, those are things that have to be watched and addressed. And all of this comes into how you as an event director are putting together your permitting. That permit is your ultimate go-ahead to move forward. And now your mitigation strategies and your medical teams are going to play a vital role in making that happen. Oops, let's go back. So with my path forward, what we're seeing, and Dr. Sienka alluded to this before, is that these mitigation plans cannot be designed in a bubble. So for us, one of the first things we did was we decided to develop a COVID-19 mitigation and medical task force. With that, we put together probably about 25 or 30 individuals, from epidemiologists to public safety folks to some of our political leaders, working, say, the Boston Marathon and other events, to start to talk about what we needed to do. Obviously, our epidemiologists played a major role in how we're moving forward with those plans. But again, if it was just the event, as I said before, we're not experts in this. So we needed to get some better understanding about what the path forward was going to be. With that, we needed buy-in from leadership groups. Look, you could put together a committee and you could have some great input, but unless they all signed off on it, then how are you going to move forward? So again, still a lot of discussions about what mitigation plans are going to be implemented, what could be pulled back. You know, I will freely admit that, you know, my involvement in this industry, as far as the Boston Marathon goes, I think we're going to be going into the 125th Boston Marathon. I've been involved with this event for 45 years and 25 as the medical coordinator. And I know that as I've put together my medical plans for the Boston Marathon, I probably have over-engineered my medical plans for a number of years. But, you know, having said that, if you look at our history and some of the things that we've experienced, and not just 2013, we've been able to respond to all of those. So to be honest with you, as I look at my mitigation plans for something like the Boston Marathon, yes, we are over-engineering those mitigation plans. We have to now, because obviously we can't pull these plans out a month or two prior to the event. And we also have to start looking at budgeting. So how does that play out as we move forward? We're working with each of the cities and towns. So Boston, as you know, runs through 8 cities and towns. That means 8 different permits. So we have to make sure that we're involving the cities, the public safety folks, and even taking it a step further this year, we're involving the health directors of all 8 cities and towns. So again, as I said, we're not working in a bubble. The health and safety officers from all those cities and towns are part of the planning. When you look at mitigation strategies, I need to just emphasize this more than anything else. Education is vital. I mean, yeah, testing, all these types of things are important, but if you don't have a robust education plan that is going to address your volunteers, your runners, your different public safety folks, that is a big mistake. We also need to take a look at proof of concept. You know, did these mitigation strategies actually work? Where obviously I'm starting to see reports out of the Pacific Rim that whether it be in New Zealand, Thailand, or other parts of the world, that they're actually hosting large scale events. Well, that's great. Love to see it. We know that in Japan that they've been, I think there was a study about 700 or so events that were run and maybe one COVID related situation out of those events. Well, that reporting is wonderful, but we need to start collecting more data, more studies, and those studies are going to help all of us move forward in our planning. And as I said earlier, what are the adjustments for 2022 that we need to make from this year to next? So, you know, one of the things we have looked at is a vaccine strategy. And, you know, as Dr. Sianka mentioned, it's a good strategy, but I'm not convinced at this point in time that it's going to work for us. 24% of the US population is vaccinated currently. That's great. And we're going to be moving forward to a larger percentage by late summer, early fall. But there are situations where runners, volunteers, whether it be religious or health issues, are not going to get the vaccine. So how does that play out in your strategy? We know there's a slower rollout in other countries. So if you have an international field size, how does that play into it? There's still travel restrictions, or those could be implemented and considered as you're working with your registration. And then the biggest thing that we're seeing, and this is, I think, a failing of many of our governments, there's no central source for vaccination confirmations. There are companies like Common Pass and others that are trying to collect this data, but how can you be certain that a vaccination passport or certificate is really going to work? You know, there's still unclear data on whether, in fact, you can still transmit the virus, you can still catch the virus, but obviously not get as sick. I mean, those numbers are pretty clear. But again, I'm not convinced that for this year, a vaccine strategy is the way to go. I do believe that some events and some of the larger world marathon majors are looking at a hybrid program of testing and vaccinations. And again, it might be the right way to go. And I think that's something that we all need to consider and keep on the table. So when it comes to testing, you know, again, as I say here, be careful what you wish for, because these things are not going to be easy. You know, as it was mentioned earlier, there are a number of different tests between PCR, rapid antigen, antibody tests. Some of these tests are obviously expensive versus less expensive, lab-based versus point-of-care testing. You know, I firmly believe for us to move forward, getting out of this pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, a vaccine is one way, but I think testing is a bigger way to get out of this. And I've been following a number of different reports, and I've really started to work and look at a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Mina out of Harvard University, epidemiologist, that's been pushing for months, if not years, serial testing. That basically it's a pregnancy test. You take it at home, and if it shows positive, you don't go to work. And I think that type of testing is a way that will help all of us. And I believe that in time, that testing will help us, again, get out of a situation where we can start to do these events again. So very important to look at this and understand the costs, who's going to be tested, all of these different pieces. And one of the biggest problems that we're looking at, particularly in a large scale event, is that how do you connect the test to an electronic verification? So similar to what we talked about with the vaccine, is there a certification, passport, whatever, that is going to show a negative test during your event? So for Boston, we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at that maybe a test prior to doing your bid pickup, and then another test prior to getting on the bus Monday morning. So with those two tests, we need to have that confirmation. And then who's going to really monitor that confirmation? Are you going to put your volunteers in a situation where they have to be the COVID police? Very difficult to do. Something to consider. What's your situation going to be with positive case management? So that if you do have positive cases coming out of your testing regime, what are you going to do with that individual? You know that with certain tests, particularly rapid antigen tests, you're going to get a fair amount of false positives, or actually more false positives than false negatives. And do you have a backup testing plan to follow up with that? Because there's going to be a customer service element to dealing with testing. And as I mentioned earlier, you've got to educate your populations about how the tests are going to be run, where they're going to be run, and to make sure it's done correctly. Because some of these point of care testing, and we're seeing so many new tests that are coming out for the home market, over-the-counter testing, that part of the problem with false positives is they're not doing it correctly. So how do you make sure that that information is imparted? And we know that basically there's going to be a mental health component of this. I think that, not just with testing, but with this whole pandemic, as an event, we are looking at the impact this is having on our runners and our volunteers. And we are really diving into a pretty significant mental health approach to make people, again, comfortable. So education, basically, as I mentioned earlier, know your audience. You have to know exactly who you're addressing, and the education is going to change between runners, public safety, and volunteers. For us, one of the things that we're doing, and I believe for Boston, we're opening up our volunteer registration in June. But prior to having that happen, for me, what I'm doing is I have 1,800 medical volunteers. So how do I make sure I'm getting a good percentage of those volunteers willing to come back? So we're going to be hosting town hall meetings with maybe 100, 200 people at a time to talk about the plans as they sit now, some of the changes that we're anticipating, and to make sure that we're available to ask questions or answer questions. And we know that they're going to be tough ones. So again, those are vitally important. So we will go through our mitigation strategies with these town hall meetings. We know that there'll be specific questions about PPEs. And that's another thing that we're all working on, is what is the appropriate amount, types of PPEs that we would need for an event, particularly an event of 20 or 30,000 people and say 10,000 volunteers. Does every volunteer need the same type of PPE? Masks, shields, gloves. Obviously, masks and hand sanitizer, as Dr. Cianca mentioned, are going to be pretty common across the board. But if people are working at a water stop, do they need a face shield? I don't think they need a gown. Do they need gloves? I don't think gloves are as necessary as they were early on. And we're dealing with, if you go back 6, 7 months, what I call this hygiene theater, that things have changed. The CDC recently just came out with changes in regards to how the virus is transmitted from surfaces. So that's going to change your mitigation strategy. It may change what you think you'll need for PPEs. Other things we're struggling on that side of things is that, do you make it mandatory or do you leave it optional to the volunteer? Questions that we haven't answered yet, but we're working through. So these are just things that we're dealing with. But as I said earlier, the education, the outreach to all groups, including vendors, contractors, sponsors, public safety, are key elements, not only in the education plan, but the whole mitigation process. So that was a very quick overview. I know there were some things I kind of skipped over because Dr. Cianca talked about it, but I will leave it at that and just say that, look, as I mentioned earlier, we're all in this together. And the only way we're going to get through this is understand and learn and adjust as we go through opening some of these events. So Chris, thank you for the opportunity. It was a little quick, but hopefully that got some of the points across.
Thanks so much, Chris. Many great insights there. And yeah, as you say, lots of information to get through. One of the points you mentioned there was the COVID-19 task force. We put a poll there while you were talking. 59% of people on the call have a COVID task force. So potentially opportunities for the other 41 to see if that's something that can help them out with their plans. Thanks so much, Chris. And we'll come back to some of the questions later on. There's a couple more in there. Thanks, Matt. You've already responded to Andreas and going to address some of his questions when you present. Just as you are getting ready, Matt, with your slides, I'm going to pop another poll in. which talks about vaccinations and mandatory survey, and throw it over to you to do your presentation, please.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to switch it up a little bit from the wisdom of Chris and John. Thank you for kind of starting us out really well there. And I want to thank Mass Participation World and Chris for inviting me to speak. So thank you very much. Just going to talk about really more of a experience we had, at least in my race, the JFK 50 miler that happened in November of last year. We'll go through here, just talking briefly. I have no disclosures. I always joke I'm looking for disclosures for anyone who wants to give me a conflict of interest in cash. That'd be wonderful, but I have nothing to declare. And so briefly, the agenda, had to add a mask on this guy's picture here. We want to discuss a little bit of the mindset when we look at safety, review what we did with that mindset, and then just consider how that might affect everyone taking their individual races forward. This is one of my favorite quotes, basically Confucius here telling us that real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. And I think there's just a lot we don't know. One of the questions in the queue was, hey, show us the studies that show that, mass participation events are super spreader events. Well, I'm not aware of any. I think it's reasonable to assume if you stand next to someone, 1 foot away for, in a corral for 20 minutes, you're probably getting an exposure. But, has that yielded studies that prove that? None that I'm aware of. And there's a lot of stuff. You just, it's expert opinion in sports medicine, which doesn't discount its value. It's just we have to be realistic. It's not a randomized, double-blinded, controlled with intention to treat, study half the time. And that's just not just in race medicine, but most things in sports medicine. When we think about a lot of stuff we do for races, maybe it's hyponatremia, maybe it's, heat, illness. We have kind of layers of care. There's always usually a nice hospital with intensivists and emergency departments or casualty departments, which will warmly greet our runners who we have treated. And we have race tents, at the finish line where we have hypertonic saline for the people who've drunk too much water. And we have code teams for those who may have a cardiac event. We have heat deck for those who race really fast in a hot, humid day. And, these are kind of secondary strategies once someone has a problem. And then as Chris was talking about, and John was alluding to, we have education. We try to tell the runner, don't drink at every water stop if you're not thirsty. Maybe it's better, instead of having a bunch of hypertonic saline at the finish line, to just educate people to drink when they're thirsty, or don't race if they have, a recent illness or chest pain. So you can prevent the actual encounter from happening. And so, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, okay, look, we know there's a pandemic. We know we have the coronavirus, out there. How do we prevent events? Essentially, with that, what we did with our race was we said, look, we need to implement something to have this race go forward. And part of that was we took the list of symptoms off the American CDC.gov webpage, and we put it into an app. And we have an app that is our EMR for all of our races that MedStar sponsors. I get no money from it. It's called Sportspeak. It's out of San Francisco. Dr. Anthony Luke developed it. And basically it's a cloud-based, HIPAA-compliant, server that essentially is encrypted. And a lot of folks will just put in their name and their information. So if they come into us, we can scan their bib and figure out who they are if they can't tell us. So we added to that a way to get symptom screen, which kind of made sense, even though we know people who have coronavirus don't always have symptoms. And with that, we said, well, why don't we ask them to get tested? And we wanted to make it mandatory, but with some of the challenges that Chris and John talked about, there was no appetite for that. And so as the medical director, I kind of lay forth my recommendations and we see what happens, because you've got a lot of players. You've got health department. I mean, we were getting calls from attorney generals, the governor of a state. Everyone had to have their say, and that's okay. It just means that I can't come down and say, this is what we're going to do. And we also thought that the many people signed up for this race before the coronavirus pandemic was realized. Probably was going on, but there was not awareness of it. So we added an additional medical waiver saying, hey, you're going to race in a mass participation event and there's a coronavirus. Maybe you should think about the risks of that. And so, that's individual. So we took about 1,200 runners, and it was interesting. There's a fair number who sometimes don't run. It could be up to 10, 15, as high as 20% some years just from injury, because it's a 50-mile race. It's a longer race, so niggling little injuries that your physio can't fix become more of a problem after 50 miles. So it's not uncommon to have people not race. But the people who were intent on racing or volunteering, we had about 781 people go to the app, register, and fill out whether they had COVID symptoms, do the survey, and then we electively asked them, would you do a test and tell us what type of test you got? Again, antigen's easy and cheap. PCR is a little bit more expensive, but maybe more sensitive specific. And we didn't even restrict them. They could do both. The majority of people didn't even know what kind of test they got, interestingly. And then we had them ask them, will you do the additional waiver? Now, we actually lost a fair bit of volunteers at this point. People started to kind of look around and say, I'm diabetic, or, I'm ski patrol and my BMI is 50. We actually lost 50% of our ski patrollers due to their general assessment of their own unwellness. And we also lost 50% of the EMS teams because they actually contracted coronavirus. To kind of blow your mind, for those who have been in lockdown quarantine, this race occurred with a general positivity rate in the public of 11%, which, if someone had asked me, hey, should we proceed with this race? I probably would say, please don't. But again, that was communicated, but a lot of times there's other people who are in charge. I'm but one voice out of many, and they proceeded with the race. And so, you talk about losing volunteers, you talk about losing medical, that changes your plans sometimes. So I wanted to show you what we got is we kind of did a almost proof of concept. Could you screen? And if you make it elective, you can see out of the 781 people who registered on the Sportspeak app, the vast majority didn't do a test. If you make it elective, most people won't do it. And that makes kind of sense, because if I've trained to run 50 miles, I don't really maybe want to know. It's kind of selfish. But, they're like, hey, I know I could have coronavirus and be asymptomatic because I'm young and healthy, but they just didn't want to do it. And so I think you have to, as Chris Torreno said, careful what you wish for. And then a large number of people got a test, but they didn't know the answer to it. They didn't know what kind they got. So, if you put it on the runner, you may not get the data that you want. Interestingly, the vast majority of people didn't do a test or didn't know what they got. There were a few that were probably highly motivated to get races back. And so, they got a test. So I find that very intriguing, because, if you throw the idea of, I'm going to test people, if you make it elective, you probably won't get many tests. You may not get reliable data. And even if you get it, there's no consistency. So you may want to consider that if you ask, please try to get a test. We didn't have available to the public in the United States at the time the vaccine, or any vaccine, unless I think you were US military or something like that. This was probably mid-November of 2020. Now that could be another thing you could ask if you wanted to put that into, say, an app or survey of sorts pre-race to try to do that preventative care. Now it's interesting because we actually ended up giving out 704 bibs, and those folks, had to pick up their bib, and one person was able to hand out 704 bibs. So it didn't take a lot of work. The app just gives you a big green check mark if you have no symptoms, a negative test, and you sign the waiver. There were folks who didn't get a bib. They were either diagnosed with COVID when they got tested, or they ended up saying, one of the questions was, do you have a close contact? And then 12 people were like, I'm not signing a waiver. And that's their right. We just had to explain to them that, one of the things you're doing is an elective activity. So we did have some exclusions, and that came from the race director, he's won this race 10 times himself before he became the race director. So he's like, look, if you show up, we're not going to give you time. If you win, you're not going to get a medal. Don't show up. And he's got some street cred that's more than the doctors. So that was good. We had buy-in from the medical director. I think if you do a quick SWOT analysis, it was super easy to do this app. In fact, some runners were like, "Can I do this for other races?" And in fact, their data is actually in the cloud for, say, Twin Cities Marathon or other races that purchase it. Everyone who got a bib did it. If you had a flip phone or you didn't, know what the Google machine was, or your older runner, fine. We could do that. You could do a paper one at, sign in. There's only one or two of those. And again, it was very low number of people that needed to implement it. I think the weaknesses we've discussed, the tests were elective, so you got to be careful about the data you got. Maybe mandatory testing would be the way to go. I certainly would have recommended it. And I think of people, it's interesting because some people have so much invested, they want their races to return. They're willing to do electively a test. Others maybe didn't share the truth. How do I know they don't have a headache or COVID toes? We're not checking at, bib handout for those. And then refusing a legal waiver is their right, but it also leads to conflicts. Are you going to give them their money back? What's your mitigation strategy if you have a positive, symptom, test, or waiver that's refused? But I do think there's an opportunity here, just like you'd educate your runners, please don't drink, copious amounts of water, or if it's hot, slow down your pace. We can still have a race. So I think this is a way to make races safer, and it's kind of piggybacking on, for those who know Martin Schwanellis out of South Africa with the Comrades Marathon, he's done park screening. It's PARQ. Just asks runners, hey, do you have chest pain? And if so, go see your GP or cardiologist before the race. It's a way to reach before the race to make your race safer. Obviously it's not a perfect strategy, but I think, going forward, it's not without its threats. It's not accurate. Viruses change, even tests may not be accurate. And, certainly I think it's one of the things we tried to do to get a race to occur. And certainly I don't think 11% positivity was the ideal situation, but sometimes you're given what you have to work with. And, with that, I'll close. I know I was supposed to keep that to 10 minutes, so I apologize if I ran a little bit off, but appreciate being here and the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. And we put the poll out, which addressed the sentiments towards vaccines while you were there as well, in terms of whether people will make it mandatory. 54% unsure, 13% yes, 33% the balance no. And then your questions there, mandatory survey testing or additional waivers, 56% said yes, 33% unsure, and 10% no. So yeah, thanks for prompting that one. Thanks for your presentation and those insights there. Plenty of practical tips. And let's hand the microphone and the presentation over to May to talk about the volunteer perspective.
So, right, I literally going to echo back what John, Matt, and Chris were presenting earlier on, but mainly into a volunteer aspect of things. So I have nothing to disclaim about. So most of my work in the mass participation field, they are actually volunteer. I'm a volunteer myself, particularly in working as a medical director for the Dublin Marathon and the race series. So I do a lot of event stuff. My mass participation events, mainly on participation, either on the runners or also on the people who actually that involve a lot of spectators. So you're talking about 30,000 to about 90,000 spectators, sometimes on a different event. So obviously for the Dublin Marathon is the participation, where else for other events that I work in, for example, like rugby or the Irish football, the hurling, things like that, they will actually involve a lot of spectators. So this is a headache when you come to trying to plan for an event, particularly in a medical field. Okay, so let's go straight in. For Dublin Marathon, meet Harry. Harry is actually our 92-year-old, the oldest volunteer in Dublin Marathon. Okay, so Dublin Marathon starts in 1980, so we have a 30-year history starting from 2,100 runners to roughly now in 2019 25,000. We haven't get there yet, together with like Boston or Chicago, or even in Houston's, or the amount of participation. But you can imagine even 25,000, it takes a whole entire year to plan certain things. And mainly volunteerism culture are very different from country to country. So I'm going to give you one good example. I was extremely gobsmacked when I visited Chris down in Boston, gone back 6 years ago. All their medical staff are volunteers. In Ireland itself, literally, we have to get contractors in. So it means we have to pay for medical volunteers. Okay, they're not even volunteers anymore once you start paying them money. But so that they are very different. However, we also have volunteers who actually dedicate their whole life because they're passionate about certain field they're into. So Harry is a runner. Harry has been joining the Dublin Marathon as a runner since 1980 when he started. So he's been contributing a lot of his time. Harry also had 3 other generations of his that also volunteers in this event. Okay, so now how do I look after Harry? So how do I protect him, in fact? In different country, as everybody knows, like Matt was mentioned, John was mentioned, and also Chris was mentioned, we all very different in the way of how we govern or the safetiness of the population in Ireland. So currently, this is our 4th lockdown. We're on level 5, not similar to UK. I've seen a few UK people there. Whereas in the level 5 lockdown is extremely strict. I'm talking about a government law where you will be fined if you are actually above outside the 5-kilometer range in your house, unless you're a frontline or working, in a hospital. Okay, so this is how strict Ireland has become. So even to trying to get into having a large field events, like what John would say, is not so much of not a great idea. The government wouldn't even allow that. Okay, so the protection part of it, a lot of them mitigated by the government, and obviously approval has to be sought out first before you can organize any event. How do we start out small for volunteer point of view to protect Harry? So I'm going to give you 2 events that recently that we carry out, and this is because that it involves a national organization, which is Sports Island. For example, the ones that Paolo is going to talk about is the Torun in Poland, starting beginning of March, where they have the Indoor European Championship. Okay, so because of the qualification start, they would need the Irish athletes to do so, and that involves the participants, which is the runners, the officials, the volunteers, the staff, etc. How do we mitigate every single risk, and how do we plan to make sure that these small events can be further carried out to improve, then become a mass event? Okay, so small steps is a good thing, and that's how we start in this. So the indoor elite championship was held in February, and what we do was we have a couple of things in the strategy planning. The first imperative point of view is communication. So it's transparent communicating from beginning of the planning till the end, including also a follow-up, a catch-up, and also question and answer, in that way. We also have providing education, how the event is going to run, where they need something, and what had happened in between. Now, the part where screening comes in, where Matthew mentioned about certain people, are you going to do antigen testing or are you going to do a PCR? We are extremely lucky. PCR for us here is actually free, and both for non-symptomatic and symptomatic. So we have a pop-up tent all over the country where if you felt that you might have a close contact or suspected that you might have a close contact, you can just queue up in a pop-up tent and get your PCR testing. For anybody who's symptomatic, they call their own general practitioner, so GP, the family doctor, where they will be referred through the system, and the system will give them through their phone number the text message where they go to an appointment time to attend for their PCR testing. So it's actually simply coordinated in Ireland where you can get a free testing. So obviously it's kind of one good thing out of this, right? So during the indoor championship, what do we do? The Elite Indoor Athletic Championship, what we do was we kind of have a very good COVID mitigation plan. We also have a COVID task force. So one of them is the appointment of a COVID officer. And the COVID officer is literally has a huge communication element to every single body, and obviously promoting how do we have a good, safe event. So number one would be we carry out the COVID health declaration form, which is the symptomatic screening questionnaire. And bear in mind, it's not just that simple. In order to ask about those symptoms of cough, temperature, do you be in contact, etc., or you have been away from country or just recently arrived, and barely for that people who just recently come back, if they're in a high-risk country that was recommended by the government to have a PCR testing, they will actually need to be self-isolation, and the PCR testing results has to be shown before they actually are allowed to partake in the elite indoor championship. So that was the first elimination. What about those people who never, including the officials, including the volunteers who never actually been out of the country? Because to be fair, and we want to make sure that the whole event itself is safe, we do antigen testing on the spot. And yes, it actually also have a significant impact. So bear in mind, it takes roughly about 15 minutes to have a result. And also both PCR and antigen testing, none of the testings are 100%. Okay, so we have to put that in place. And also we have an isolation rule with a lot of PPEs and equipment being all equipped properly. Every single personnel, including the participants, the officials, okay, the media staff, they all have to be swabbed for antigen testing on the day when they arrive. If you have arrived for 2 days of the event, the 2 days of the events, you need 2 swabs. Okay, if it's obviously positive, you will not allowed to go into the stadium at all. And also on top of that as well, we also have providing a lot of education online just to make sure that they understand where to seek for help, who that they have to be in contact, where they have to go if they display some symptoms, okay, and who to contact and for follow-up. In their COVID health questionnaire itself, we have a direct consent from them, okay, that we're allowed to contact them for contact tracing if any one of those people in the stadium had contracted SARS-2. And bear in mind that because this is in regulation with the GDPR, we cannot just simply call them. So we ask for consent on the questionnaire so that that consent has been done very strictly. Also, during the induction program before the event, we clearly advise people who are at a high-risk group. So high-risk group in the Irish perspective context for the health service executive, which is our health government, okay, will say that anybody over 70, okay, in fact, anybody is over 70 before the vaccine comes out, they have to be self-cocooning, okay? Then the second part will be if they have a high-risk chronic medical condition, so cardiovascular disease, cancer, or they're currently receiving chemotherapy, if they have BMI over 40, any pregnancy. So those are all in the high-risk group. So we ask those questionnaires and ask them to be transparent and be upfront, because ultimately we're trying to protect everybody else, including themselves. So there is no whatsoever, blockade from anybody. Also, for planning perspective, we always have what you call extra 10 volunteers who can step in, okay, and also do the questionnaire and also do the antigen testing if they have to be arrival, because they'll be on the screen, and also is accreditation is needed as well. So if your name doesn't appear on accreditation list, you cannot go in and be swabbed in the first place. We also have a temperature screening for everybody else. So it's not just so much of the athlete perspective, we make sure that every single volunteer in. How do we address their concern? It's very simple. They can email me or they can have one-to-one video confrontation with me, okay? And on those induction and follow-up education, they also can ask the question. Some of them, for example, we have a 72-year-old who is one of the referee and asked that, what do I do here, May? Government has asked me to self-cocoon. I said, you do the right thing. And bear in mind that sometimes because volunteer is so different, they are so passionate about what they do. And you constantly want to remind them on the same time as well, yes, you have this situation. It might not be a great idea. I can't stop you. If you do want to be present, you take all the steps that is needed to be, which is your social distancing. Okay, we use 2 meters here in Ireland. Your mask has to be worn all the time, okay? And a lot of older generation people find it difficult to wear masks. So usually allow them to wear the shields, okay, on the same time. The third part will be that, make sure that they inform you straight away if they have any symptoms whatsoever. All right, provide the hand sanitizers like John would have mentioned. However, we also have a video, and also make it clear that hand sanitizer is not a replacement for your hand washing. So preferably hand washing or hand hygiene is extremely important. Then the hand sanitizers goes in. okay, after that. So we have hand sanitizers all around the building to provide it to people. Okay, last but not least, also their respiratory etiquette. Make sure that if they do sneeze or whatsoever, make sure that they sneeze on their elbow. So these are the general steps that is part of the education before the event goes in. Different organizations has a different way. The other one that's currently on at this moment, this week, is the Swim Ireland. So it's a swimming competition for qualifying for the Olympics. And that's the reason why they have this. Now, in Swim Ireland's recommendation for everybody, okay, they have to have a PCR testing 60 hours before the event. Bear in mind as well, as you all would know, PCR testing has its downside because has been shown that certain people who previously had COVID, okay, their PCR could be still positive after weeks or months. So what did Swim Ireland do as an organization? Because they want majority of swimmers to be, qualified for the competition, right? So for those people, they are not, mandatory to get the PCR because knowing that the fact that this might occur. So they asked me, and thank God they do listen to medical directors. Then I said, to be fair to everybody, and we know that how hard they train, but it also that what are other people's else's safety. So it means your volunteer safety, your coach, okay, and also those people that working in the swimming pool, which is the National Aquatic Center. That's where we use for the event. So you have to be fair in every single way. So those people who did not get their PCR testing 60 hours before the event, they will have a spot check antigen testing. Okay, and there is a rule that says that usually that I would do twice if there is positive. So the first one is positive, you do the second one. And I also have a PCR testing kit as well. If they're both positive, they have to go to PCR, and PCR prospectively come back less than 18 hours. I will get the results, and so that I have a 24 hours to buy to make sure that the test that we do is that if the three of them came back to be positive, that is just pure bad luck that the person cannot actually participate. So overall, the event itself is not just about the athletes itself or the runners or the participant. It also involves the spectators, and it also involves the volunteers. And without the volunteers, there is no mass participation. So we do need to make sure that when we look at the general, we have to have a 360 view that everybody is safe, because the last thing you want for an event is that if a lot of people does get SARS-2 from the event, number one is the brand itself, your event brand itself will be jeopardized. And for the in 2020, we did not have the Dublin Marathon because we know that for the fact that if anything would have happened, okay, number one, we cannot get the permit to start off with because the government wouldn't allow a mass event to be held anyway. But the second part was, if this is going to carry on, if we are allowed, do we want to go there? There's no direct planning. Everything was new that time. So it's extremely difficult to kind of sit down because like what Matt say, okay, we cannot be ignorant in that way. We have to see what's coming on and based on evidence base in that way so that every single event that we carry out, okay, will be safe for everybody, including our volunteers. All right. I think my one is kind of done in that sense. So I would say to everybody, stay firm. The day will come. Would that be a normal? No, it's going to be a new normal. So how the new normal is going to look like for mass participation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, May. Thanks for all those insights. Amazing volunteers there that you've got, and the lifeblood, both from a medical perspective and event perspective generally. Just that you would have seen the results of that poll in terms of people returning. Quite a lot of optimism, I guess. Q2, Q3, Q4 accounts for 60, 75, nearly 80% of people thinking that they'll be back to live events before the end of the year, which seems to be great news. Thank you, May. And running the last lap of the relay, leg number 5, handing over to you, Paolo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you. I hope it's coming through fine.
Got it there. Thank you. Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and also giving me the chance to share what we have been doing at World Athletics in races and what the last year looked like. We know that the impact of SARS-CoV-2 has been devastating on mass participation event. These are data coming from the Endurance Sports Coalition that the IIRM with other US Northern American organization have created last year. And these numbers are incredible. I mean, $3 billion US a year in the US alone, the impact of events, endurance events, and taking into account road running events, 17 million people registered for running events in the US only in 2019. I mean, if we then add numbers coming from the rest of the world, the impact of stopping events worldwide has been really devastating, not only in terms of health lost due to the not exercising or to the disease directly, but also financially speaking. Still, we don't know, and as I had been said first, we don't have evidences of outdoor transmission. Those initial evidences or I would say anecdotal evidences that were shared at the beginning were not based on relevant studies that were properly published in peer-reviewed journals. Still, they were taken for granted from the very beginning, and all mass events stopped. The information that we have now shows that there is a very low risk of transmission compared to indoor events, of course. Although these evidences are still in their very early stages, it's very hard to put up a study, and take a bunch of people with COVID, a group of people without COVID, mix them, blend them together, let them run and see who's positive at the end. I mean, I think that from an ethical perspective, it would be quite challenging to convince an ethical committee to run that. But we all had to get creative, right? So this is the example of the Bundesliga in Germany, how they organized their return to sport last year. And when it came to outdoor races, I mean, we saw all sorts of strategies of possible solution of grid distancing, and it's been quite a creative year, I would say, and from that perspective, very interesting. Still, we have on one side a huge impact on logistics, budget, human resources to implement all this new way of organizing events. On the other hand, the information on which these assumptions are made are of low quality, not published in published or peer-reviewed journals. So we're basically doing something that we don't know whether it will be effective and whether it's necessary, but it has a devastating impact on the logistic and financial aspect of a race. What are the resources available? Well, last year, the WHO came up with a risk assessment tool that was made for mass gathering sports, but mainly targeting stadium-based events. So it didn't really apply to the context of road races, of plenty outdoor, over long distances events. That's why we gather other international endurance sports federation and organization, you can see here, and we decided let's do something that fits our scope and what are the specific characteristic of our events. As you can see, besides World Athletics, we involve the UCI, the Cycling Union, World Triathlon, rowing, and winter sports, with particular regard to cross-country skiing. We try to make then this a worldwide effort involving the WHO, the Olympic Committee, the Paralympic Committee, of course the IIRM, and I think that we did it was an interesting experience. We produced this tool called IIRM tool that has the objective of help event organizers to assess the risk of the event in a quantitative and qualitative way, establish the public health and sport event mitigation preparedness, and clarify the steps to take to further mitigate and reduce the risk. The tool, it's online, it's free, it's open, you can use it as many times as you want. There's also the possibility of looking how things have improved, whether the situation has changed during, by implementing mitigation action, for example. An interesting concept that we introduced with that effort was the pendulum of risk, where we imagined the future months or years, that was back a year ago exactly, as a continuum swinging pendulum going from an active pandemic to post-peak, contained outbreak, and seasonal outbreak. And so far, this has proved to be very much true, considering the different waves that we've been going through all over the world. So we're swinging from one phase to the other. which means that we need to keep our awareness high and always keep into consideration the mitigation measures and contingency plan that need to be implemented for these events. We have seen different type of strategies being implemented. Of course, this depends on the type of event, the duration, the location, the number of participants, the logistical and financial capacities of the organizers, and then the local government regulation. In vast majority of cases, also in other sports, I'm not only talking about road running, we've seen a stage 1, which includes prior to get to the competition location protocol to comply with, which is usually a PCR result that needs to be negative, and confirming that that person is not experiencing any symptoms, hasn't been in touch with COVID positive, or is waiting for the result from their own test. And then a stage 2, which means what happens after the person has arrived on site. And usually this includes either a PCR, LAMP test, in some cases antigen testing, based on the resources and the time available. We have decided as World Athletics to go with LAMP testing for the reason because it's a direct measurement of the viral presence. So it looks for the viral genetic material in the swab, and it has a sensitivity and specificity that it's much closer to the real-time PCR. So that's extremely reassuring in terms of the methodology and how it works. It's much faster than a PCR. It's actually 1 hour. Then you have different, of course, companies that are producing different brands, but usually it's a 1 hour time to get the result. And this is what we applied in our World Half Marathon Championship back in October in Poland. We had approximately 650 tests over 3 days for a total of 235 participants. They were both the men and female half marathon. And we tested them with LAMP. I'll show you a quick video of how that looked like so you can get an idea of that.
The first time we do it for such a big event like the World Championships, and we have tested this before in single-day event like a Diamond League meeting, and it went pretty well, but we didn't have such a big amount of athletes, so I think now we are about to test this. All starts at the airport at the welcome desk, where teams will be given a welcome bag with masks and gel. They will be transported from the airport to the hotel in dedicated buses. As soon as they enter, they will leave their belongings there, and they will have to go to this large room with a waiting room before the COVID-19 testing. We have a new technology called LAMP, L-A-M-P technology, which is analysis of genetic material, which is some kind of PCR testing, but that gives a faster result. So we are able to get the result in less than 1 hour.
that proved to be an extremely interesting experience. We learned a lot. After that experience, we updated our protocol with a new document that was released early this year. And then in the meantime, we started quite a bit of conversation with the Tokyo Olympic Games organizing committee around the protocols that they will be implementing during the games, which to some extent will be very much similar to what we have tested our event. And then what we will be doing next week in Silesia in Poland again, in Katowice, for the World Athletic Relays Championship, which it's slightly different from what we have done in Gdynia. We added a third stage. So all those that will go to Katowice next week are required to provide us with a negative PCR test result before departure. They will be tested on site. As soon as they arrive from the airport, they'll be taken to a specific place where they will be tested with LAMP test. And during their stay, they will be retested every 48 hours with LAMP test again. We have organized the whole system so that tests will be done in the evening, for example, from 7 p.m. until midnight. So they in the hotels. So people have, I would say, a rather large time window to go and provide their samples. Then they sleep over it, and by the following morning, we will provide each one of them with the results of the tests by email. So we're trying, of course, to be considerate of their schedules and their plan, but still we want to ensure that everyone is safe throughout their stay. Again, this is not a one-day event, which to some extent would probably make things easier. It's a 2-day event, but people start arriving a week before, meaning that we need to make sure that throughout their stay, they are safe for the whole time. So just to conclude, and this is something that we are trying to educate also our member federation about. The objective of the health and safety protocol is to minimize the risk as much as possible. It is important to remember that a certain degree of risk will always remain. Protocols can be as strong as we like, but if people don't follow the rules, it becomes compromised and everyone's health could be in danger. And with our behavior and choices, we all contribute to the health and safety of the entire community, but both those participating to the event and the local hosting community. That's it from me. I'll be very happy to take any questions if there are, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Thanks so much, Paolo, and all of our presenters. Why don't we jump in? There's a few questions in here, and we're going to give an opportunity for, I think, either Chris or John just to give a quick bit of background in terms of IIRM and the work that they do. We're running quite far over time, but I really want to try and take some of the questions. Some of them are comments. So Gabriel asked for that link, which is in there already. From a... Yeah, we spoke, I think we've answered Andreas' second one. Patrick Bassett, you were asking about studies, and Chris mentioned, and I heard a whisper as well, that there's a study coming out from Parkruns, which will be released on the work, and Paolo's nodding as well, so work that they've done there around outdoor transmission. That Japanese survey that Chris alluded to, we did some survey mass participation world last year. We used that as the foundation block, and we got to 812,000 runners across events that contributed to the survey with only one case. And we're about to restart that again and start trying to add with a view that we have an updating score on an ongoing basis in terms of number of runners and cases. There's been a couple of studies starting to be released recently, and I'm sure the group on this call, our presenters, are much more aware than me, but I saw a recent article in the Irish Times which quoted, I believe it was an Irish study, saying that the transmission rate 1 to 1,000 or 0.1%, and then there was one in California which said 19 times more likely, if I'm correct, or 19 times more at risk in an indoor environment than outdoor. Stefan Movin, there's an ongoing UK government research in terms of their return. The link is in there in the Q&A. And I think, Andreas, if I'm right, your questions have been answered by Andreas there. So let's just quickly pop into a chat. I know there were one or two in there. who would like to tackle this one? And I think you touched on it, Chris, in your presentation. Tom Kerry's comment, surely it's the space available for an event, not the numbers of people that enter as a limiting factor. You're nodding, but would you like to comment on that in any way? Chris, just unmute yourself.
There we go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, it's space and time. And for large events, can you utilize what the smaller events are doing? So for us in Boston, you know, obviously we reduced from 30 to 20,000 in field size. That's pretty much going to happen. The other thing that we made an adjustment on is that we're going to be doing a rolling start, so that we know that the high contact points, i.e. Expo, which we're still going to try to do if our mitigation strategies are approved, but even more so is the busing from Boston to Hopkinton, or any type of busing from one location to the start. Those are going to be high touch points, high concentration areas. I think if you could address those appropriately, but then also incorporate a rolling start that you can socially distance, which is going to mean that you're going to need more time to run your event. So obviously that's where you've got to get the buy-in from public safety and your cities and towns to extend what could be a 6-hour event to 7 or 7 to 8. I mean, it all depends on your field size, but it's doable.
Thanks, Chris. There's another question in here from Nigel Rowe. What do you call large races in terms of numbers? Who would like to tackle that one?
Chris, I'll take that to some extent. This is a relative term, a relative statement, really. You know, what's a large event? A large event would be anything, in my mind, over 5,000 runners or 5,000 participants. But more importantly, it's what can you do to make that field safe? So a large race could be 1,000 runners in a community that doesn't have the ability to support the safety measures necessary. I'll go back to the last question and say I kind of dispute the notion that space takes care of everything. You got 20,000 runners, it's going to be hard to keep them all apart. You know, you can do it at the start, but what do you do once they're running? You know, people are competitive. They're going to be running next to each other. We don't know that that's safe. You know, breathing hard in a competitive environment. I don't know. I don't think it's just about space. I think it's about numbers of people and what you can do to support those people.
Thanks, John. I think it's more a comment, but I'll throw it open to people to say, anyone on the panel, from Charlie Mussett. We won't see a level playing field when event impacts are considered. No one counts how many go outdoor to bars right now anywhere in the UK, yet an event in the same city has to show how their numbers won't impact on transport, hospitality, etc. Anyone like to pick up on that? Maybe Paolo, we throw that one to you.
That's a very good point. Although I'm not sure how bars are, you know, how many people can accommodate. If 20,000, if that's the case, I mean, I would like to see that. But I think that's why it's then put on the burden on the organizers to prove that they won't have a further impact on the city. But I of course agree with you that, I mean, there's been some inconsistency here to what it should be provided by those that organize events or you know, manage venues.
Yeah, thanks. And certainly, I mean, that's what I'm hearing from the industry regularly on the strength in numbers calls and other forums, is just that, I guess, frustration that what's not allowed for our industry, you know, 20,000 people in a stadium, 30,000, 40,000 people in a stadium, but not allowed more than, you know, in some countries, 250 people. And I think that's part of what we've touched on this call is, you know, we have a responsibility, we have a duty of care, but we also have a responsibility as an industry to do more education, to show how safe our plans are. And you know, Chris made the point that we need more data, we need more studies, and fortunately, there's more and more of those that are starting to come out. And, you know, on that poll, there seems to be increasing levels of optimism, but, you know, the duty of care comes back to us. All it needs is one bad or two bad events that end up on the front page of newspapers, and the whole industry is compromised. So, we have to take responsibility for the safety of participants and the industry. Folks, we are over time, but I would like to just quickly give an opportunity. IIRM do some great work. Who's that? Chris or John, you're going to talk to that. I've got a slide that I'm going to pop up there. So Chris, I'll try and get the slide up for you. Just a couple of minutes, and we will send this out. We're obviously recording. It's live on Facebook, but we'll be sending an EDM out. As I said, we had just over 300 people registered, so we're going to be sending out to all those that couldn't attend, and also, put that information there. So if you have to jump off, feel free. But I'll just bring this slide up quickly while Chris talks to IIRM.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity. The IIRM was established probably over 10 years ago by Bill Roberts, John Cianker, George Champus, and many other very prominent race medicine medical directors. And over the time, we've, again, developed a level of what I would consider standards of care that we would like others to consider. We don't want to be considered the ultimate in regards to how medical programs should look around the world. But what we wanted to do is be a resource. Now, we know that as we're dealing with COVID and talking about COVID, when it comes to medical care at events, one size does not fit all. So can we provide a resource and a level of education to a variety of different events, whether it be road racing, triathlon, charity walks, whatever it may be, and give people an opportunity to see what others are doing, share information, collect data, that type of thing. So we're, I would say, a relatively young organization. We've not really spread much beyond the United States borders, but I think one of the major pieces of our progression has been partnering with Dr. Ademi and World Athletics, with Ames, with Paco Barral, and getting us to be truly an international organization. So what we're trying to do is just, again, work with others, share data, and as I've talked about in my presentation, provide education that people can look at and learn, and collectively move forward with a medical program that fits for all.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you. Thank you for that share. I'll just stop the share of your screen there. And obviously, we're hoping that through MPW, we can help you spread that footprint through these kind of things and through our conference and whatever into other markets. And, collaboration is key. It's one of the great strengths that's come out of COVID. And, May's comment in there as well. Thank you, May. Do please reach out for sharing. More we know, more we can mitigate risk. It's a combined effort. The reality is, the one consistent message that I'm getting all across the world, and I speak to people in so many countries. The aid station now, we've spoken to people in 50 countries, and we have lots of countries joining us on our strength in numbers calls. It's just so localized. It's not a one size fits all, but the more information we have, the more opportunity we can take that to our governments and our agencies, the more case studies we can get. And those don't need to be 30, 40, 50,000 people events, but the more 1,000, 2,000, 5,000s that we have that are giving us some proof points, the better chance that we have to continue to return safely. So I think that's it. Just a couple of very quick reminders before I thank our panelists. Strength in numbers, Monday and Tuesday next week. You only have to register once, but we get some great insights from that. Same time, same place in 2 weeks' time. Disaster strikes, case studies from short lead time event cancellations. Road Ahead newsletter, which we send out every week. So tomorrow, if you're not on our database, please let us know. And we're very happy to help you with those, and always here to help, connect, share, contact me directly, chris@chrisrob.asia, or join with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or the like. And then really now just a chance to do a quick wrap and a very big thank you, a medical perspective to navigating safe and sensible return to mass participation events. Thank you, Dr. John Cianker. Chris, I almost gave you a doctorate there. Chris Troyanis, Dr. Matt Sedgley. I think Matt's had a bit of a problem, but he's got his cola there taking his place. So hopefully he can enjoy that in the morning time as it is there. Dr. Maytan joining us from Dublin, and Dr. Paolo Emilio Adami joining us from Monaco, I believe. Thank you to those of you. I know we've run over time, but hopefully it's been valuable and useful. Thank you so much, Chris. And in the background there, Barbara, who's done a lot of the heavy lifting in the background. Really looking forward to working with you further. Have a good day, good night, rest well wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.